Hi, my name is Rebecca Menmuir and I'm a DPhil student at Jesus in my third and maybe final year. I work in the English faculty and my thesis is broadly on classical reception in the late medieval period. So my thesis is called Ovidian Exile in the Middle Ages, and it focuses on the Roman poet Ovid, his exile poetry, and how this poetry was read in the period roughly between 1100 and 1400 AD. So here I'll give a bit of background on Ovid and how he came to be in exile, and then why medieval authors both loved Ovid and rejected him, sometimes simultaneously. No one has really looked systematically at the influence of Ovid's exile in the Middle Ages, but I found that in lots of different contexts it played an important part in shaping how people understood the classics, understood Ovid, and the concepts of what it meant to be in exile or to be marginalised at all. So Ovid was born around 43 BC, and he tells us in his Tristia that he was plucked from a life of politics to become a poet, unable to resist his muses or the draw of the other poets that he was reading. This led to him writing perhaps his most famous work, the Metamorphoses, but crucially he also wrote poems of love, the Amores and Ars Amatoria. A lot of the Ars Amatoria is essentially pick-up poetry, where Ovid teaches men and women how to flirt and how to love. And it seems that these poems offended the emperor of the time, Augustus, who was imposing increasingly strict laws on morality. And in 8 AD, Ovid was relegated, which is a type of exile, to the very edges of the Roman Empire, on the Black Sea in modern-day Romania. His crime, he himself tells us, is Carmen et Error, a poem and a mistake. So the poem, the Carmen, is probably the Ars, and the mistake we're not sure about, although there's been a lot of speculation about it. And we believe that he remained there until his death in about 17 AD. During this time, he continued to write poetry, but it was much changed. So the Tristia, or sad things, Epistulae ex Ponto, letters from Pontus, and Ibis, which is just a name, are full of Ovid's lamentations, thoughts, and curses from exile. And in these letters he pleads and he wheedles to try and beg Augustus for clemency. It doesn't seem to have worked, but Ovid's textual corpus now includes these letters from exile. And Ovid was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages. Of the authorities who were trusted and cited in the period, he stands among the Bible, the Church Fathers, Virgil, as one of the most prolific sources. But he was both famous and infamous because he had written, on the one hand, edifying poetry like the Metamorphoses, but he had also been exiled for these salacious and erotic poems that he had written. And I'm looking at how the exile poems fit into this. And because I found that because they're so penitent and deferential, they're often seen as edifying. So Conrad of Hirsau wrote in the early 12th century his dialogues, and in them a pupil says to their teacher, "Why should the young recruit in Christ's army subject his impressionable mind to the writing of Ovid, in which even though gold can be found among the dung, yet the foulness that clings to the gold defiles the seeker, even though it's the gold he's after?" So in the pupil's mind, and in Conrad of Hirsau's mind perhaps, Ovid's poetry is dung, even if there might be some gold. And the teacher replies, "This is grounded in good sense. Even though some of the writing of that same author Ovid might have been tolerated up to a point, namely the Fasti, the letters from Pontus, the Nut, and some others, who in his right mind would endure him croaking about love, and his base deviations in different letters?" And it's interesting, there are clear lines set between different poems from the same author. So these poems are good for the young Christian soul to read, but these croaking base deviations are absolutely not. And in this way it seems, and the critical consensus seems to be, that there was a sense of there being multiple Ovids in the Middle Ages. So the teacher Ovid, the lover Ovid, the mythographer Ovid, the penitent exile Ovid, lots of different facets of him. But I think that the exile poetry might help to reconcile these disparate Ovids, and in part explain why Ovid was just so popular in the Middle Ages. An interesting fact to me about Ovid's reception is the fact that his work was moralized or even Christianized in the Middle Ages. And for a pre-Christian poet, this needed some imaginative gymnastics, but they often managed. My research looks partly at how the exile poetry fits into this. So in exile, Ovid is actually the perfect penitential figure, someone repenting from past wrongs and begging for mercy. In conjunction with the rest of Ovid's life story, this maps well onto a medieval Christian framework. So I found that the final chapter of Ovid's life, the exile part, is a necessary part of understanding Ovid as a whole and as an author and authority in the Middle Ages. In this way, it can't be left by the wayside in scholarship, as it sort of has been in the past century. So while there may be dung in his corpus, as Conrad, his characters say, the figure of this repenting figure from exile justifies his inclusion in the canon. And it seems that people did enjoy the dung, as it were. The racy love poems, they were very popular, but the exile poetry legitimizes the use of the other infamous Ovid. That's just an aspect of what I work on, and I hope it was interesting.